This is the story of Aeroflot Flight 3352. But before we get started, the channel is starting to near 200,000 subscribers, and it would really help the channel if you could just subscribe if you enjoy the content. Now, on to the video. On the 11th of October 1984, an Aeroflot Tu-154 was to fly from Krasnodar in Russia to Omsk, also in Russia. The plane had 170 people on board, including 24 children. The flight to Omsk was normal. Nothing worried the crew, and before long, it was time for the crew to get the plane down into Omsk. The weather at Omsk was not the best that it could be. It was raining, and the operator of the airport was concerned that the wet runway would impede the braking action of the landing planes. So he ordered two UAZ 469 cars hitched to trailers with specialized equipment to dry the runway. Now, the Russian source that I'm using for this video says that the equipment that he used blew hot air on the runway, thereby drying it. Here's a translated quote. Turbines hummed on the cars, directing the flow of air onto the strip. Cars moved slowly along the runway. End quote. Now, a few months ago, I saw a post on Reddit which showed a MiG-15 jet engine being used to blow snow off of runways and other surfaces in Russia. I wonder if this was something like that. If you know more about this, please do let me know in the comments below. Here's the thing though. This work was being done on an active runway, so a lot of care had to be taken. When the work was started, a beacon on the car was flashed. When the beacon flashed again, your time was up and you had to evacuate the runway. There was one unwritten rule though. You never went onto the runway when the runway lights were on. But this being Soviet Russia and everything, that unwritten rule was frequently broken as electricians sometimes turned on the lights for testing purposes. As the cars went down the runway, drying it as they went, the lights for the runway came on. But no order to evacuate the runway came. The guys in the car probably thought that this was just another test for the electricians. But unknown to them, Flight 3352 with 170 people on board was getting ready to land. On the jet, the crew was lining up and they transmitted that they were ready for landing. But no reply came from the controller who was on duty. So they asked again, and this time they were cleared to land. As the jet broke through the clouds, the pilots turned on the landing lights to see if the powerful lights on the Tu-154 was able to pierce through the dark sky. But it did the opposite. The light reflected off the rain, and this created a sheen that partially blinded the pilots a bit. The captain asked for the lights to be turned off. As they got lower, the captain decided to turn on the lights again. As they did that, they thought they saw something in the distance. He asked, "What's there on the runway?" The navigator replied with, "Yes, something is shining." Something was shining, and it was the cars that were on the runway. They had not cleared the runway, and Flight 3352 was almost on them, literally. They touched down on the runway smoothly at 270 kilometers per hour, or 167 miles an hour, or at 145 knots. Then they saw it, the cars on the runway. But it was too late for them to do anything. From their cockpit, they could see the cars try their best to get out of the way of the jet that was barreling towards them. But it was too little, too late. The passenger jet slammed into the cars that was loaded with 7 tons of fuel each, and the wreck exploded into a fireball. 174 people on the plane and 5 people in the cars lost their lives. The cockpit section of the plane broke away, and thus all of the pilots were safe. When the firefighters reached the scene of the accident, they found the captain in a bloody shirt telling them that he had asked for permission to land twice. He had no idea how something like this could have happened. A passenger jet had just landed on a runway that was otherwise occupied. Now the question was, why? Tenerife had just happened 7 years ago, and after that, a massive push had been made to make sure that something like that did not happen again. How did it happen here? The answer is not as simple as you may think. A long string of mistakes fed into this accident. Let's understand why. First off, was there even a need for drying the runway? Well, that was debated, as some people thought that they did not need to dry the runway, as the bit of water that would remain could turn into ice. But here's the kicker. The person who was in charge of the ground forces did not ask the flight director for permission, but he asked the ground controller. Now, the ground controller had no authority to clear the cars onto the runway. That was not his call, but he did it anyway. Then after that, the workers on the runway massively messed up. You remember the beacons that I was telling you about? Yeah, those beacons were mounted on top of the cars, and they had devised a system where one flash of the beacon signified the start of the drying session, and the second flash signified the end of the session. But that was not how it was supposed to be. They had to have it on continuously for as long as they were on the runway. But the workers did not do that because they found the constant flashing of the light to be a bit annoying. Now, the pilots of the jet had no idea that there was someone on the runway until it was too late. On top of all of that, the cars that were on the runway did not have radios on them, so they could not hear the approach controller clear the passenger jet down to land on the runway. But now that brings up the question, why did the approach controller do that? Well, as the jet came down, the pilots had a sneaking suspicion that the runway was not clear of obstacles, so they asked the approach controller about the status of the runway. The approach controller contacted the ground controller about the status of the runway, but the ground controller never replied, so the approach controller tried again. No reply, so he got in contact with the flight director. From what I can tell, the flight director is a high ranking official at Soviet airports. Then, the approach controller got a crackly, barely legible transmission from the flight director, and the transmission appeared to say Bodna, which is short for Svobodna, which stands for free. With that, the approach controller, now under the impression that the runway was clear, cleared the jet to land. You might be wondering why the ground controller did not reply to the approach controller. Well, that was because he was asleep. The man fell asleep after clearing the cars onto an active runway. And what's even more sad is the fact that he did not activate the runway busy sign. This meant that no one had any idea that the runway was busy. The ground controller was asked about this during the hearings after the crash, and this is what he had to say. Quote, "I don't remember, but if the records confirm, then it all happened." End quote. But there still should have been at least one person that should have been able to prevent this from happening. There should have been someone who should have been like, wait, no, we have cars on the runway, go around. And that person was the secondary controller. But the secondary controller was not present at this airport due to staff shortages. Had another set of eyes been there, this accident might have been avoided. In the end, the investigators found that a lot of people had messed up on the job. The flight director was supposed to have a top-down view of everything happening at the airport, and he did not do that. The ground controller was asleep, and the head of the ground crew had not communicated with his team what they would be doing on the runway. In fact, he wasn't even at the briefing before the work started. The approach controller was found to be negligent because he allowed a plane to land without a clear and proper reply from the person on the other side. At first, this accident seemed like an open and shut case. One person fell asleep and that caused it, right? But in reality, there were a lot more things at play here than one first realized. There were so many ways that this could have been avoided. Had the flight director done his job, he could have caught their mistake. Had the approach controller waited for the right radio transmission, then this might not have happened. Had the secondary controller been present there, then there might have been someone who could have caught the massive mistakes that were being made at the airport. But unfortunately, that is not how things unfolded on the night of October 11th, 1984. In this accident, I really do feel for the ground controller. I do not for a second think that he was negligent on purpose. He was just 23 and had two young kids, and he had lost a lot of sleep in the days before the accident, caring for his kids. But ultimately, he and the flight director were sentenced to 15 years in prison and the approach controller to 13 years in prison. The public outrage for this crash was understandably huge. So much so that the court sessions for this crash had to be done under the guise of armed guards. They feared that members of the public might want to harm the accused in some way. This really was an insane accident, even by Soviet Russia standards. At the time of this crash, this was the deadliest crash in Soviet history. But unfortunately, that record did not stay with this crash for long, as this crash was surpassed by the crash of another Tu-154 about a year later. What do you think about this accident? Is runway drying even necessary? Should this have even happened? Have you flown an Aeroflot? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to watch another video, then how about the story of Aeroflot Flight 6502? It too is an almost unbelievable story. You can find the link to that one on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.